Hi, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Conscious Grief Series 5. And today I am joined by Wilka Roig, who is a transpersonal psychologist. So welcome to the Conscious Grief Series, Wilka.
Thank you, Tara. It's nice to be here.
It's lovely to have you here, and you have a wealth of experience to share with the listeners today. Like, it's extraordinary, the amount of modalities that you've trained in, and you do some extremely fascinating work in this field that we're going to hear about. So I'm very excited to talk to you. But it's always interesting, like, how people come to work in the space of death and grieving. So I was wondering if, first of all, you would mind sharing a little bit about your personal journey and what brought you to this space.
Yes, of course. So, if we look back in our lives, I think for all of us, we can look at how everything has contributed to who we have become, right? So, but if we had to sort of pinpoint a moment or a time in my life, the first time that I experienced death firsthand, someone else's death, it was a freak accident of a friend when I was a teenager. And everything about that just stirred up so much. And my sort of impulse was, we all need to gather together, sit in a circle and talk about what is coming up for us, So I look at that now and I identify it as the first time that I felt a calling to hold space for grief without knowing anything about it. And I think the beauty of it is that back then we had no idea about grief or about loss. None of these concepts were imposed, and therefore we were able to have these very open, honest spaces of exploring what was coming up for us. We did that a few times. And then after that, all of the closest deaths that I've experienced have been accidental, suicide, all of these sudden deaths, right? Which have invited a relationship with mortality and with grieving that is very undeniable. And between the first two big deaths of my life, I had the privilege of working at a bookstore and being the one who was in charge of receiving books and registering them into the system. And therefore, I was able to firsthand, receive the books by Stephen Levine and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and Thich Nhat Hanh. And so because this had opened up for me, this curiosity about all of this, I dove into those books early on as well. So I think that's probably the main moment, right? But then life took me different directions. And then when I came back to psychology, then it became very clear to me that everything that we are dealing with as we are facing our lives, trying to make sense of what's going on, trying to work on our wounding, all of these things, it's the work of life and it's the work of end of life. And I also understood that, life is made up of losses and we are constantly grieving something. So in a nutshell.
Well, that's perfect. And nutshells are good for this first question, but thank you. Yeah, it's truly fascinating. And I identify a lot actually with what you were saying, sort of starting to find books and then getting fascinated in the subject that, often seems like a very sort of macabre subject, but actually kind of sparks light in us because that's interesting for some of us. Now, I was thinking actually about your title as a transpersonal psychologist, and maybe for some people who don't know what a transpersonal psychologist is, that would be interesting for you to share.
Yeah, of course. So, there are many branches of psychology, let's say, or we can look at the history of psychology, and we have these particular schools or movements in the field. So the transpersonal came after humanistic psychology, so after Maslow and all of that. And it started out actually in the 60s with the different explorations that were taking place specifically in Palo Alto, California, and that, you know, that area there, with the exploration of consciousness, what is consciousness, and how the self is not just identified by their own personal experience, but also within the context of something greater. And so transpersonal psychology considers that placement in relation to, you know, our collective history and also nature and the universe even. And so in a very broad sense, it's about understanding our purpose, meaning, function, not just within the small context of the individual, but within all of the broader context, which also considers spirituality and other dimensions of human experience, let's say.
Well, thank you so much for clarifying that. And I personally feel like it's such a supportive type of psychology to know that we are part of something bigger than just this sort of material realm that we can, see. And when we're talking about grief, especially, one of the things that can happen is that we start to think about, where do we go when we die? And what is the point of life? And what am I doing here? And what is my purpose? And like these extremely big questions that some people may have never thought about before. And I can sort of see you, like, you know, feeling excited about those questions as well. Those are questions which honestly I was thinking about very early in my life. And it sounds like you had an experience very early in your life where a best friend died. It's always crazy to me that more people don't think about these things earlier. But yeah, I think this is where the transformation can really come in terms of how we perceive our life. So if you were going to talk about death awareness, you know, as a portal for collective evolution, you know, what would you say about that?
There's just so much to say, and I think I'll start by, you know, I don't know if all of us have these questions, but I remember having these existential questions from as early as I was able to understand that, you know, that I was this sort of living organism that was part of something bigger than myself as a child, you know, forget about the universe or anything, but just understanding that there is life and death, and that there is, you know, that things are not permanent. All of these questions started very early. And I think many of us as children have that curiosity, right? And needing to sort of make sense of existence. But let's see. So death as portal for transformation and collective evolution is a theme for me that is the driving force, you know, because it's about sort of reclaiming the rightful place of death as a necessary part of a bigger cycle of life, right? And how actually any kind of death makes new life possible, right? And so when we're talking about death, it could be small death, or let's call them big death, right? So smaller losses that allow for something to not be able to continue, or as big as when somebody's dying, dead, and then that cannot no longer continue. These are all invitations for what else is possible. So, you know, as I have looked at it and seen it and understand it, holding space for others, but also in my own experience, without change, you know, change implies loss because things can no longer stay the same, right? But without loss, then we cannot make room for what else is trying to be born, whether it's through us or in a bigger context of the collective. So I don't know if you want to, want more specific guidance about where to go with that.
Well, I think it's, what comes to mind, and this is maybe kind of a strange thing to say, but we live in this very death-fearing culture,
Mm-hmm.
and we like to prolong life as much as possible, or prolong death, depending on how you look at it. So some people are maybe living longer because of medicine, or being, just keep prolonging life. And then, because what you're saying is, we need death in order for new things to come in. Okay. And then there's a lot of people I know right now who are struggling to get pregnant, for example. So sometimes I wonder whether there's any even correlation with that, because of I know that there can be infinite numbers of souls in the universe. But there's also something when we are, as human beings, I guess, trying to control things so much and have so much control. And we just really don't like death because we cannot control it. But we do a pretty good job with medicine and so on and so forth these days. And who knows where things are going with science, because they're talking about all kinds of technology to keep people alive, or freezing people and things like that. So I don't know how you would say death awareness, for example, could be a portal for collective evolution in that sense.
Yeah. There's so much in what you just said. It's difficult to know where to begin, because the first question that comes up for me is, how did we get here, right? To making a priority of prolonging life regardless of quality of life, and doing, intervening in certain natural processes because we can't. So there's that part. And then this idea of holding on to things and not letting them change, right? So what is growth and evolution is not change. We cannot evolve without change. We cannot evolve without loss, right? We can't. So to me, it seems it doesn't make sense that we would want to freeze things and hold on to them as if time was not moving, and as if there was no effect to being in time space, right? So when we observe nature, which is the greatest teacher, we are nature. We're not just part of it. We don't just connect with it. We are that. It's a reflection that shows us that everything is constantly in motion and changing and growing and transforming at different pulse rates, let's say. Some it's slower and something's faster, and therefore something's more evident and something is less evident. But ultimately, everything is in this constant motion. So to me, it is not natural to want to stop that, right? And in fact, our constant trying to stop it, while it may seem like success, when you're working with the dying and when you're working with the grieving who are facing these things without trying to deny them, nobody agrees that those things are actually helping us. So my approach is, if we connect with our mortality, become more intimate with that, knowing that death is inherent in life, because the moment that something has life, it can die, right? That's just how it is. Then that's a different approach that I think would serve us much better than to be denying it, not making it a part of our life, and then being shocked by it, upset by it, wanting to stop it, which is unnatural.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And I also think that if more people had the the belief that we are spiritual souls having a human experience, then the next incarnation or the next, death is the next place that you're going to evolve to the next space, and that potentially could be quite an exciting prospect, as opposed to feeling so afraid of the next phase of life or thinking that there is nothing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a whole other sort of space of conversation and exploration, because, again, when we are so close with grief and loss and change and death and evolution, all of those things, which to me are all connected, I don't even think it's a matter of belief. Right? Because in a way, when you believe something, it's almost like this kind of like hopeful, well, if I believe it enough, maybe it's true. Mm-hmm. But when I think, loss, and especially, big losses, can, if we let them, bring us into a very honest place.
Yeah.
Where all of these stories we've been told about loss and about who deserves to die or all of these things just are wiped off very quickly. And so this new relationship with reality, with life, with who we are, all of these things and what we may be can be more accessible. And so when that happens, and when people allow themselves the vulnerability to let grief transform them, because grief is really like a process of transformation, then they don't have to believe things because they live them, right? So when you live them in your first-hand experience, they are true. There's no question about it. You don't have to believe them, right? So, I had the first experience of this nature with my friend who died when I was 17. And, this is what happened to me. I don't need to believe it because it happened to me, that he came to me and guided me in how to support his mother as she was grieving the loss of a young, very young adult. And I don't have to question that because it happened. And there are witnesses who also shared that experience with me, right? So I don't need to worry about believing it or whether it's true. I don't need anyone else to believe it. It was my experience. So when we let ourselves be guided by our process of grieving and whatever happens there, there is a truth about what we are and who we are. And I'm sure you know this, holding space for grieving people, it's incredible the kinds of experiences they have with their dead loved ones, with who they are becoming, with how their environment begins to collaborate with that transformative process.
Well, I love to work especially in groups with people so that they can, share those experiences or signs that come and, the opening of new awareness. And at first, people don't want to feel like they have to learn something, through these very, very painful circumstances. That can be a hard thing, to accept in the very early acute stages of grief. But it is, you're not the same person anymore. And therefore you change, regardless of whether you want that change or not. I mean, obviously, some people really want to resist that for as long as possible. But when the people do get to a stage where they begin to accept it and realize that new things are happening, new relationships are forming because of the loss, then there is an opening. And I always kind of, try and teach people through the idea of conscious grieving that if we keep that openness, having an intention to see, what are the opportunities that are opening up, how can I keep my heart open as I grieve? What can I do to support myself while I'm in this pain and suffering? And then a lot of people talk about there being a choice point, that when am I going to allow myself to let go of the suffering? And all of these questions and this terminology that we use, all of this is part of the transformation and growth that occurs. And I know that you're living in San Miguel de Allende. And I've always been really fascinated with Mexican culture because of Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead celebrations. And I don't know whether something necessary, like because of the way that the Mexican culture have this awareness, that death is part of life, that many of us in the West don't like to consider, don't like to think of, we have a lot of ideas around, when it's an acceptable time to die, or a good death and a bad death, and all of this kind of thing. Were you drawn to Mexican culture because of that?
No, espérame. I'm just making some notes because there's a lot that just came up in what you said. But in terms of the Mexican culture, I think it's an interesting thing to talk about a little bit at least, because so before colonization, right? So our original peoples, not just of Mexico, but of many different, from the Americas, had a particularly healthy, relationship with death as part of life and making life possible. And if we, go back and learn more from the traditions, some of which are still alive, we understand that recognizing ourselves as nature and being so connected with the cycles of nature also allowed our ancestors to really collaborate with that. And depending on, there's a whole, we can think about how our collective evolution has gotten us to this place where now we're just individuals and we're just in it for ourselves, and all of these other, and there's this illusion of property and this illusion of separation and this illusion of control, all of these things that have come up with, sort of industrialization and all these other things. But if we go back to how it was before, there was a healthier reaction, or not reaction, or relationship. Then what happened is that, some other set of beliefs and expectations was sort of laid on top of that. And so what we see today, not just in Mexico, but in, different Latin American cultures, is that there's actually, on the one hand, like a syncretism, which is like a mixture of both what we brought and what was laid on top, but also a conflict between the two, because there was a time when we were made to in order to survive, we were forced to abandon our truth collectively, right? So what we have today is a sort of very confusing process where people have been conditioned to fear death as part of the way that we were controlled, several centuries ago, right? And so up until the moment of death, and even through the early stages of grief, the relationship we have today is a lot more complicated. And it's actually, there's a lot of work that could be done there. It's still seen as a punishment, as a tragedy, as this only happens to bad people, so how am I bad? These kinds of things are very alive, not just in Mexico, but in Latin American culture as well as Western culture. What is different is that in some of our Latin American cultures have been able to rescue or protect in some way the ways in which we stay connected with our ancestors, right? So what used to be the case is that the moment that you die, you become ancestor. And so there's a relationship between, after death and what stays behind. And that's what we see in the Days of the Dead. And we see in the sort of those traditions, not just here, right? So other countries in Latin America have it. What has happened with Mexico is that, there's been a spotlight on it that has. So what happens today in Mexico is that we are fabricating parades like, James Bond movies made up. That didn't used to happen in Mexico. Now it happens, right? And so that now we sort of make a little bit bigger what happens in Pátzcuaro and in Michoacán in general because of the movie Coco. So it's kind of an interesting, I don't even know what to call it, right? So there was the original things that we used to do. Then there was like, ¿cómo se llama? Colonization. And then there was this big conflict. And then now we are again mixing with something that's being put on top. But ultimately, what I can say about the current traditions that we still have, whether they're ¿cómo se dice? Syncretic or whether they've been influenced by James Bond and Disney, still, it does allow for the continuing bonds, right? So that part of the grieving process could be more supportive for healthy grieving, but the fact that we still think that it's a punishment and all these things gets in the way of that as well. So it's not as smooth as we would like to think.
Yeah, and like you say, that's the mix, right? From the colonization, I'm sure, because it is very much a mixture of sort of Catholic tradition and the ancient tradition. And I totally had that feeling myself when I was younger, that I'm bad. I must be a bad person. A lot of bad things are happening to me. And it's like you say, it's very, very common for us to feel that way, rather than accepting it as part of our life here. Mm-hmm. Now, I would love for you to share, I know that you do so many different things, and I see the dream work that you do, and whether you'd like to share about how some of the ways that you work with people.
Well, actually, what I'd like to share, because my notes were about dream work, because a little while ago, before we started talking about these different cultural traditions around death and grieving, when we were talking about how grief is a transformative process, and how conscious grieving, bringing awareness to that process, allows for us to be able to maybe surrender to it, allow for it to work on us or guide us. But also it invites a collaboration on our part to understand that process is saying, this is what needs to happen now. This is where we're going now. Even when I don't know right now who I am or why I'm here, so there's this kind of interesting sort of disorientation that then reorients us into the person we are becoming, right? So right there, that is a way in which we can see how, death is a way of sort of encouraging that collective evolution. So what I was thinking was, so I worked with dreams as part of my, my personal practice, because in fact, dreams with the dead have guided a lot of my life over the course of my life. And so dreams have always been something that keep me going. And after, studying psychology and then transpersonal psychology, I understood in some way that maybe it's not so easily articulatable. I don't know if that's a word. There's something about the space of dreams and our consciousness and where we come from and where we're going that is connected. And I'm not here to theorize about it. There could be other people who would want to do that. But from an intuitive place, this makes sense to me, and it has been my experience. And so because I worked with dreams more actively before I worked with death in this most conscious way in the last 10 years. I understood that when we go to sleep, it's as if we are connecting to this all possibility, this sort of like the consciousness that we all are outside of being in these bodies. And that as we return consciousness into the body every morning or whenever it is that we wake up after dreaming, that what we can remember about dreams is just these bits that make sense due to our personal human experience. So when I started working with the dying and working in the portal of death, so to speak, of being with someone whose consciousness will be leaving the body soon, something dawned on me that, it's just the way I make sense of it. I'm not saying this is true or that it's going to resonate with everyone, but it just started to feel to me that with every death that I've been a part of in one way, so because I'm holding space for it, because it affects me, because, all of these things, it's almost as if my own portal to that collective consciousness is broadened with every death. So in the same way that this happens to us when we are sleeping and dreaming, it happens to us in a really big way when there's a death. And then that grief process is kind of like making sense of the dream, right? And it's just because it's bigger, larger scale, it just takes all that much longer than if we just think about our dreams. And so I wanted to offer that because it's something that has like sort of bridged my work over however, since the 90s until now. So now all of these things come together in a way that I didn't even realize. But that has been building over time through experience and through my own interest and curiosity about these topics.
I have clients who sometimes they want to so badly to have dreams, about their loved ones, and they're asking for them to come, please visit me in my dreams. And obviously it doesn't always work on demand like that. Do you have any thoughts or advice for people?
Oh, yes. Yeah. So this is the thing. From where I stand and the experiences I've had and that others have shared with me. So we have access to whatever that is all the time, right? So for some of us, it's easier, or we already have a facility with being connected to that or remembering, because the thing is, we do have dreams, we just don't remember them. So, but we also can have that experience in waking life. So when we're looking at synchronicities, and these other symbolic manifestations that happen around us all the time, it's about cultivating our capacity to notice them, right? So we've been conditioned to not notice anything, not to pay attention to our dreams, not to pay attention to synchronicities or anything like that. So you would have to then, on the one hand, you can work on dream recall, and there are things you can do, and there are supplements you can take, or, herbal things that can help you to remember, because it's about remembering. But on the other hand, you can have an intention to be more aware of your waking dreams, and to say, it's not just that I need, they don't need to just show up in my dream time. They can show up in my chance encounters. And, it is a sort of a practice that we need to cultivate. But for some of us, actually, that's more accessible than dreaming about them. The other thing I want to say is that each of us is, from my experience, so it's true to me, we are all messengers from the other side for those who are still here. And so we also can just open up to, on the one hand, being messengers, and on the other hand, receiving messages from wherever they come. Sometimes you open a book and the message is there. Sometimes you walk outside and something falls from a tree and the message is there. Or sometimes you're walking somewhere and you hear a song and the message is there, right? So how much are we willing to receive of what is already there?
Well, I love that, because I very much have had that feeling from certain people, I think she's like channeling my mom. Or, you know, my sister has 3 children, and even when they were very little, I was thinking, I think that's my mum speaking through them. So yeah, it's I've never heard somebody kind of confirm that to me before. So it's
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and it's happened to me that I'm saying something, and what is coming out of my mouth, I'm like, where did that even come from in terms of the way it's being constructed? That is not something I would ever say, or I don't even. And then somebody will say, "Oh, that's exactly what my so and so used to say." And so for me, I've learned to trust when I have this impulse to say certain things that I don't understand why they need to come out. And there you go. So, or you know, like when you feel like just doing this nice gesture for someone, but you don't really have a reason, and you do it, and it has a meaning.
Yeah, I often think that with gift giving as well. So some people are very intuitive with buying gifts and knowing what people will like, and maybe not always giving them at a birthday or Christmas, or you know what I mean? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a lovely thing to remind people of, and give people the confidence to do that and to share things. And as you were saying about synchronicities as well, that you know maybe through our sort of brokenheartedness or our pain, or when we become more sensitive, we're able to notice those synchronicities more. You know, we have more quietness around us to see things.
Yeah, and in fact, I just thought about 2 things. So hold on. So if you notice, when we are in the process of grieving, a lot of things are sort of disordered, right? So we may not be sleeping well enough, or we may be sleeping at odd hours, and we may not be hungry for the things that we usually find nurturing, but then we're suddenly choosing other things. And there's a general sort of disorientation that is a part of the process, and that is, there's nothing wrong with it. It's very normal and natural to be disorganized after a loss. I find that those changes also contribute to our capacity to connect with that other way of perceiving, right? So if you're sleep deprived and you're eating odd things, like you're chemically different, your brain is working differently, you have brain fog just from the grief itself, and all of these things together make us have to navigate from a different point of reference than we are used to. We're not able to like be linear thinkers for a while, you know. There's a way in which we could give into that trance state. And then in a way, that's part of what can facilitate our capacity to receive those signs and notice them and, you know, feel into them.
I love what you're sharing, because like you say, we're in this like linear way, and we're always thinking like, oh, I can't concentrate, like I have to do this, I have to do that, I'm behind on things. And actually, when our life is completely disordered and chaotic because of some tragic circumstance, it's again this opening, this opportunity, that if you can surrender to it. But the trouble is, we're so sort of conditioned, and I often, you know, I've said this in other interviews, like our obsession with being efficient, for example, or thinking we're so lazy if we just sit and cry and not eat all day and be in the wallow. But actually just encouraging people to be like, allow this, see what comes from this space of that you've never been in before, you know, and just forget your to-do list. You know, what really matters, what do you really value?
Yeah, and in a way, it is in allowing those spaces and those times that we can actually move through the grief and heal through it and transform through it. When we are like, no, I have to be productive. Oh, I have to be efficient. Oh, I have to go back to normal or whatever these things that we are told, then we are actually setting aside completely the possibility for transformation and evolution. And we are not making the room for who we are becoming, which is a big necessary, part of that natural process of evolution, individually and collectively.
It is. So, yeah. So true. It's so true. And it's like the idea of the butterfly and the chrysalis, taking the time. And that's kind of where I realized in my life, like I had been unconsciously grieving because our mantra in our life was just stay busy and be strong and keep going. And, you get a lot of praise for like keeping it all together and not stopping your degree at university and, being outwardly successful. But internally, I was like, very dead inside and it wasn't until I took time and space in my life and changed where I lived and didn't have the distractions that I was able to feel my grief, feel my pain, connect with my parents. And that's when I realized that was my conscious grieving.
Yeah. I mean, and it brings so much wisdom. To be able to be still with whatever that is also part of what allows to have emerge what we are ready to know, right? So experience gives us all this wisdom, but we don't ever sit still enough to connect with it, right? So grieving has its own, loss has its own wisdom that it gives us. And so that's another reason why to be still, right? So you were able to recognize like, oh, this is what grieving is, and this is the importance of it. And now I understand that I am being conscious and intentional with it, right? So then, your whole rest of your life has like flowered from there. Yeah.
Yeah. And my whole experience of life, because, I wasn't living fully. I wasn't grateful for my life. I just was like, what, this life is just like, why am I here? What is it all about? What's the point? Feeling just a lackluster for life. And when I actually connected with the pain, then I was able to connect with the joy more and the excitement and the awesomeness of life. And oh my gosh, like this planet's actually amazing, as opposed to being like in this sort of mist the whole time and not seeing things.
Yes, that's a great point also, how, we've been conditioned to resist pain and to resist discomfort and to resist challenge or to just overcome. And it is only when we allow like the full spectrum, which includes the discomfort and the pain and the suffering and all of that, that we can actually have the full experience on the whole spectrum. Right now, and I've been saying this recently a lot, it's like, there's this like happy good campaign.
Oh my God.
And it's like the whole thing about being alive is that you strive to be happy and that you have a good day, good night, good this, good that. It's like, wait a second. That is so one-dimensional, right? We want to have the full spectrum of experience. And then, we can have, as you said, joy and awe and really be able to appreciate being here and the beauty of it all, regardless of the pain, or which includes the pain,
Yeah. No, I have literally written those words actually in that you've said, like we're obsessed with happiness, and any discomfort just alarms us because we have extremely comfortable lives, many of us, in terms of warm homes and comfortable beds and food delivered to us, and and so whenever discomfort comes, we immediately like take a tablet, pour a drink, check out, because we don't like to feel even the smallest amount of discomfort. And yet that is very much part of what we're doing here, to feel it all.
Exactly. Yes. So I just wanted to say one more thing about the dreaming thing, because this is another element to dream work in general, is that this is something we have to pay attention on a regular basis, right? So if, you haven't paid attention to your dreams and now you want a dream with your dead loved one, you have to pay attention to all your dreams and acknowledge all of them. And then that sort of opens the door for having the dreams with our dead loved one, right? The other thing is invite others to share dreams with you. And so that we're sort of more in that dream space more regularly. And then sometimes others will begin to dream for you until you start to remember your own. So there's also a collective thing that happens there. Wherever and however we can connect to that collective consciousness, it doesn't have to be through our own, right? But then surrounding ourselves with that and encouraging that then allows for us to also be more aware and connected to it.
Okay, that's very helpful for people to hear. Yeah, and a really, lovely thing actually, that people can connect and create kind of their dream communities through and support one another as well. Yeah. This conversation's gone very fast, Wilka. I'd like to ask people, if you, and it's totally your own interpretation, of what you think conscious grief looks like.
Yeah, well, to me, conscious grief is acknowledging that there has been a loss and that there is a change and that things cannot continue the way that they are, and make room for that unknown space, that dark space, before something new takes form. The conscious grieving is in allowing grief to guide that process, and that there is no prescribed way in which it's going to show up. It is the way it shows up that guides the way. And that conscious grieving is about acknowledging and then honoring and taking the time with it, right? It has its own pulse and its own rhythm. You can't fast forward through it. You can't speed it up. You can't step away from it, even if you think you are. So I think conscious grieving is all of that. And then also saying, okay, not only am I being intentional with what's happening, but I also will collaborate with it, which is what I also have said before. It's so then understanding, okay, so this is telling me I need this or to do that or whatever it is, as much as we can.
Yeah, thank you for that. I like the collab.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we complete our time together?
I would just say, thank you. This was a wonderful conversation. I love to get to know you and your work, and to the more conversations we can have like this, I think it's also doing a service collectively.
It is. Yeah, it really is. No, you're really fascinating lady to have on this series. So thank you very much for taking the time. I know that you are very busy and have lots going on. So I really appreciate you being here and for everything that you've shared. And I know that other people will take a lot from this conversation, Wilka. So I look forward to sharing it with them. And to everybody who's been listening, thank you so, so much. And we'll see you next time. Bye.